And my challenge, we are met at this chosen ground to settle for good and all. Who holds sway over the 5 points? Us natives or the foreign hordes?
It's an epic film. It's a page out of the history of the development of our country.
Everything that happened in the country happened in New York first.
In Martin Scorsese's new film, nominated for 5 Golden Globes, including Best Actor, Best Supporting Actress, Best Director, and Best Picture, the audience is shown a New York unlike they have ever seen, exploring the corruption and conflicts that gave birth to America's greatest city. Starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Daniel Day-Lewis, and Cameron Diaz.
I wasn't aware of the history of New York in that time.
It was surprising how Dickensian and it's almost medieval with the dirt roads and so dilapidated, really startling.
At that time, it was literally like wooden shacks and 2-story buildings, and the 5 Points especially, particularly, was such an ultra-violent sort of world.
The film tells the story of Amsterdam, who as a young child witnesses his father's death at the hands of Bill the Butcher. Later, he returns to New York to avenge his father's death.
Lord, with this knife that struck him down, let me put to rest my father's ghost.
The young boy comes back from the House of Reform, sent away for 15 years, and wants to kill Bill the Butcher for killing his father in an earlier gang war. It's very tribal, very primitive, but that revenge drives him and drives the story.
You! What is your name?
Amsterdam, sir.
Amsterdam. I'm New York.
In terms of finding a revenge, getting the revenge on Bill the Butcher, he has to gain the Butcher's trust.
I was raised in a very similar establishment myself. Now everything you see belongs to me, to one degree or another. The beggars and newsboys and quick thieves here in paradise, everybody owes, everybody pays, because that's how you stand up against the rising of the tide.
This relationship that I have with Bill, I can't help but admire his life and who he is and the way he conducts himself. And there's a certain affinity that I have for him. So it's a much more complex revenge story than just me chasing him for the entire film. We actually become friends, and it becomes this relationship where he almost becomes like a father figure to me.
This is a wound. The stomach will bleed and bleed. This is a kill. This is a kill. Main artery, this is a kill. You try.
He didn't count on one thing, and that is his heart. He didn't count on the feelings he'd have for Bill and also for Jenny Everdeen, whom he met. Jenny's an interesting character because she represents part of his digression.
That one.
Part of his realization of his feelings, his emotion, his feelings of love.
Not much of a dancer.
Just try to keep calm.
I've never been to a step-in ken before.
It's best not to look down. You can hold me tighter if you like.
Basically, all 3 characters in the movie, Amsterdam, Jenny, and Bill the Butcher, are pretty much composite characters. I represent sort of the new world that's coming in, sort of hordes of immigrants that were coming in at the time. And he's a pluralistic character. He's somebody that represents the new world and what America was to become. Whereas Bill the Butcher, he's a nativist, and he represents the old world, and he wanted to keep the power amongst the people that he felt built the country.
My father gave his life making this country what it is. Murdered by the British with all of his men on the 25th of July, Anno Domini 1814. You think I'm gonna help you befoul his legacy? By giving this country over to them what's had no hand in the fighting for it? Why, because they come off a boat crawling with lice and begging you for soup?
Bill, even though you can understand his conviction, you don't agree with his conviction, you don't agree with his racist points of view, but you understand how he could feel that way, how he thinks he sees things.
People were more inclined to stick within their own communities because they felt strength in that.
They didn't come over to become Americans. They came over being Irish people in America. So they stayed in these tight-knit groups and gangs. Most of them didn't want to stay there. They just wanted to make enough money to go back.
I related to it in the sense that, you know, at the end of the day, it boils down to territory, you know what I mean? And what's so interesting is, I mean, these are the origins of gangs in America.
The O'Connell Guard, the Plumduggly, the Chichesters, the 40 Thieves.
Dead Rabbits. The American Guard. The Atlantic Guard. The Slaughterhousers.
The Bowery Boys.
Confederation of American Natives.
These people wore their colors, they had their outfits, you know, trying to represent who they were and stake their territory, but all trying to fiercely remain individual from everybody else. And it's a combination of, you know, their ethnicity and their religion, a culmination of a whole bunch of different things, but it's basically the same story repeated.
I'm fascinated by history, and I'm fascinated by the history of America, and also the history of the city.
I literally knew nothing about this world and how significant and important it is in our history, and it's in none of the history books that I ever read.
The Irish came in huge numbers in the third and fourth decades of the 19th century because of the famine in Ireland. They fled Ireland in droves. And why did they come to New York? Well, they went just about everywhere, but New York was the biggest and most available and closest port. If you draw a straight line west from Ireland, it's New York and Boston were the easiest places to reach.
I think that first great influx of immigration from Ireland was the first great test of what America's supposed to be. This bring us your homeless and your poverty-stricken and those who are oppressed, etc., come to our country and become a citizen and work with us. But there were so many, so fast, and for such a prolonged period of time that it created that who has the right to be here situation, which is something that we deal with every day, I think, in America.
I said there were more Irish during that point in history than there were in America than there were in all of Ireland. They were basically perceived as the lowest of the low. You've got to see the caricatures of how they portrayed Irish people, almost like these beasts that couldn't even speak. They were constantly drunk and mindless.
And one of the reasons they reacted against the Irish, of course, was that they didn't speak English. Didn't have trades, for the most part. I'm just generalizing now. But most importantly, they were Catholic. This is a period of time where they're still fighting to preserve a country that had a separation of church and state.
That's the building of our country right there, Mr. Cutting. Americans are burning.
I don't see no Americans. I see trespassers. Irish hops. What have they done? Name one thing they've contributed.
Votes.
Votes, you say? They vote how the Archbishop tells them, and who tells the Archbishop? Their king in the pointy hat, what sits on his throne in Rome.
Bill's got mixed feelings as regards the Irish.
The racism of the time was astounding, and don't forget, we're dealing with the Civil War, too.
The rivalries had a lot to do with ethnic identity. These native gangs were identified with the Bowery, and the Irish gangs were further east into the 5 Points. And neighborhood turf was absolutely everything to the gang members. And I think probably a good guess for the average age of a gang member was probably about 16 or 17, probably down to as low as 12.
I mean, they did every possible thing that you could do.
Yeah.
At the time, the corruption was unbelievable when you really get into the history of it.
Ghoul gang slaughters, a fresh outrage in the 5 Points. It's a notice you can be proud of.
Thank you.
Low thing to do that to a baddie. Low.
Why? They could have left that ship with nothing. Instead, they made the Police Gazette a periodical of note.
There was a time when the line between criminal and hero and decent human being and not so decent human being were very muddy and murky.
Violence has always been a part of all urban settings everywhere. In particular, if they were port cities, which New York emphatically was. Violence is part of the fabric of New York, has been from the very beginning, and you can translate this to any port in the world.
You have to remember the country had sort of come into being around 1789, I think, and it was 1860, and the place was being torn apart by war. So, in effect, it was still being tested as a country and still being formed as a country. And there are other issues with the politics, because a lot of it's very corrupt, personified by William Tweed character, who later became the famous Boss Tweed, who's the name now. Whenever they mention corruption in America, everybody knows Boss Tweed.
He was really the most corrupt politician
ever, really. I mean, he was ripping off hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, even then. Just ruthless. He set the pattern for corrupt politicians, I think.
That man was right born for this.
He's killed 44 men, laid low a couple hundred more.
Is that right?
That's right.
I should have run him for mayor.
Boss Tweed, William Marcy Tweed, was himself of Irish stock and grew up in an East Side tenement. Came up through the ranks and was in one of the leading lights, if not the leading light, of Tammany Hall. He pulled the strings. He controlled the gangs to the degree that the gangs were an unofficial arm of enforcement. The gangs were not officially on the city payroll, but certainly some of the gangs functioned as if they effectively were on the city payroll, and they worked for whoever happened to be wielding the most power. That's how gangs operate. You know, besides protecting themselves and their turf, they are available for hire to whoever holds the club. And since Tweed did, he effectively controlled the gangs.
Now, what is it that you are so fond of saying, Mr. Tweed? And Mr. Greeley, you weren't like this, but what is it? You can always hire one half of the poor to kill the other half.
Bill the Butcher was a butcher and a brawler and a gang member. He ran a fire company, the Red Rover. There was not one centralized fire department at the time. It was a collection of voluntary companies. Gangs would have a link to a fire company. A fire company would kind of own gangs, etc. And there were, at any given point, up to maybe 30 or 40 of these companies. One detail you see in the movie is the man sitting on the barrel covering the fire hydrant to hide it from the rival companies. Yes, rival companies would have fights over who got to put out the building, and there was obviously looting involved. There was a financial interest.
Boys, forget that one. Next building over. Mustn't let it spread. Take what you want from that one.
What are you doing? What are you doing? There's nothing wrong with this one. This is my house.
The state set up the Metropolitan Police Force, and for a while you had these two competing police departments fighting each other, releasing each other's prisoners. And the city was chaos. Criminals operated with absolute impunity because they knew that if they were arrested by one set of cops, the other set of cops would set them free. So it was just anarchy.
The fight's over!
Didn't anybody pay off the goddamn police?
We paid the municipal police. This is the Metropolitan Police.
Over the years, Martin Scorsese's films have defined a vision of New York life for the world. Gangs of New York continues the filmmaker's love affair with the city.
I suppose for all of us that we weren't kids, but we were just starting out when Mean Streets first appeared in Britain, where I was living at the time. It was really like a light went on. Taxi Driver, we saw time and again. Raging Bull, New York, all of them. That was our discovery of this place through Martin's eyes. It amazed us.
I can't be so presumptuous to think what Mr. Scorsese is thinking about his films, but he's made some other films about New York, Age of Innocence, Goodfellas, and in a way this is sort of in my mind anyway, a prequel to some of those stories.
I've been luckily making pretty much the pictures I wanted to make, but there was always one picture I really, really had in mind was Gangs of New York, a film set in that period, in that place and time, of dealing with the history of New York and dealing with all these extraordinary characters that were around at the time.
It was a project that he'd been wanting to do for over 20 years, and it never happened. All the pieces didn't come together in the puzzle, and finally we got it financed, and he was ready to go, and I was overjoyed.
Getting offered the job is one of the great excitements. Like for actors, you know, you have various jokes. Like if that's Scorsese on the phone, I don't tell him I'm busy or something. And then when it really happens, it's really exciting.
The people must be made to understand that all these things are best kept within what I like to call the Tammany family, which is why I'm talking about an alliance between our two great organizations.
You're talking about muscle work.
That too. Muscle to match our spirit.
You own the crushers, get them to do it.
The police? Oh no, Jesus, no. The appearance of the law must be upheld, especially while it's being broken.
It was a wonderful group of people. Obviously, you know, being able to work with Mr. Day-Lewis, who is, you know, such a inspiration to so many young actors, who's somebody that's so committed to his roles and his characters, was a huge thrill for me, and I know he does an unbelievable job in the characters. One of the more menacing, treacherous characters ever on film.
He didn't act. He literally became Bill the Butcher.
I'm 47. You know how I stayed alive this long? All these years. Fear. The spectacle of fearsome acts. Somebody steals from me, I cut off his hands. He offends me, I cut out his tongue. He rises against me, I cut off his head, stick it on a pike. Raise it high up so all in the streets can see. That's what preserves the order of things.
Cameron, she just kind of switches the lights on when she's around.
She has this great face, and she's got a lot of range, and all three of them together are pretty wild.
Anything in your pockets tonight?
Oh, I ain't started working yet.
What about that locket that I gave you?
Leo is a fine actor. I think for a lot of people, they'll be quite astonished to see the transformation he's made.
Would you back an Irish candidate of my choosing?
I don't think so.
What if we get you all the Irish votes?
Now, I might be persuaded to back an Irish candidate for, say, alderman.
Alderman.
We've already got Irish aldermen.
So we have. That's why.
What's bigger than alderman? Sheriff. Sheriff. All right, Mr. Tweed. You back an Irishman for sheriff of the city and county of New York, and we'll get him elected.
Action.
Well, we have a movie about New York being shot in Rome with English and Scottish actors playing Americans, American actors playing Irishmen, and a cast of Italian extras playing American. It's a bit of a circus out there.
We had thousands of Italian extras that didn't understand a word of English. Everyone move this way, scream.
Go that way, yeah.
Every time I mention to people that I'm shooting this Martin Scorsese film called The Gangs of New York in Italy, they get this startled expression like, why would you shoot The Gangs of New York in Italy? As soon as I got here, I realized why, because they built this whole town with 2 ships in a harbor and this whole main street.
Well, we'd all heard the rumors about what Dante was up to, who became like the wizard of the 5 points. But to actually see it with one's own eyes, it was quite astonishing.
It was like stepping back into time.
Everything looks like it's had a life, that it's been around for so many years. It's pretty amazing.
In terms of images and in terms of the scale of it, Dante worked on this movie for, I think, almost 2 years. And we're treating his sets like we're shooting on location. We can photograph like almost everything in every direction. It's all like 360.
That section of old New York was built so that if we wanted to do a scene inside Satan's Circus, let's say, which was Bill the Butcher's place, and we wanted to change it to the barbershop, which were Monk McGinn, that was his place, played by Brendan Gleeson, it was all ready to go because it was all pre-lit. And people say, oh, Marty, you spent almost a year in Rome, pre-production and shooting. Oh, it must have been great. I said, no, I was in New York. I was at the 5 points. I don't know about you guys.
You laughed, did you learn any Italian? I'm like, no, I was in New York.
Dante Ferretti did an incredible job in every little detail.
When I met Marty for this movie, when we start to talk about this movie, he gave to me 5 books full of researches. And then I make a sketches, big sketches with all the information I have. And then I showed all this to Marty. Marty approved this, and then I started.
There's the old Don Whiskerando barbershop that you built. These rock formations and everything are based on real photographs of the period.
Yes, Manhattan was full of rocks, and then they take down everything, they put everything, they make everything flat.
And the 5 points is down there. That's the burned building that was covered with ice the beginning of the film. This building over here, this also was from a photograph, I think, of Jacob Riis.
Yes, exactly.
But that's from the 1870s, so 1860s, something like that. The rock and the way the fence is formed.
Do you remember, Marty, the very beginning from Venice?
It's nothing but Venice.
From Venice.
We stopped, there was nothing here. It was all flat.
Yeah, all flat. Yes, okay.
Well, I think it was very important for us because the actors, when they get there, it's a real place. I don't think sets like this will ever be built again. And the scale of the exterior sets. Interior sets, yes, of course, there'll be bigger sets. But the exterior was the whole area of downtown New York. Now, the costumes are very important because it was a very colorful period, particularly of the underworld. And I think we have many records of what the upper classes and what the middle classes wore. But only few of the lower classes in the criminal world or the underworld.
Like any period film, the first stage is looking at the actual period, looking at things from the real period. So that was from 1840 to 1860. And you look at paintings from the period, but luckily for us with this, the daguerreotype had been invented, so we had photography to look at and looked at lots and lots of photographs.
Sandy, she manages to be faithful to the historical side and at the same time give it the flair that it needs.
I don't start with a drawing and then say, let's find the fabric that will work for this costume and this is the shape I want. I start with the fabrics. So that's probably the most important thing to me, is to be surrounded by fabrics that I like and inspire me, and that's usually where it starts. And the drawings are something I do quite a long way down the line. I mean, I do them, and I do little scribble drawings for the people making the costumes, which are more diagrams. There is a range within this film because apart from things like the dead rabbits, the Native Americans, we've got people who live in the brewery who are slum dwellers, like really, really low, raggy-looking people. We've got politicians and smart people who, along the lines of Boss Tweed, but then we also had things like the Chinese pagoda scene with Chinese opera, so that went completely off on another tangent. We had to do costumes for the Bowery Theatre for the play, Uncle Tom's Cabin, so there's been a huge range, actually. One of the great things about working with Marty is that he understands clothes and costumes and loves clothes. It makes it much easier to work with a director who understands what you're talking about, and he's got the most fantastic memory. So if you show him something, he'll remember it. I mean, I was really impressed when I would show him reference pictures, and he could actually tell the difference between one year and the next. You know, he'll go, oh yeah, that sleeve's a 1857 sleeve, and that's a sort of after 1860. It's quite incredible.
We had the idea that the gangs themselves, there were so many gangs down there, the colors they would wear, that they'd be able to see, one gang member be able to see another gang member coming down the street, and he or she would know who they were and who they're affiliated with. For example, in the case of the dead rabbits, we knew that through research that they used red stripes. In some cases just down the side of the pants, another case across the shirt. Sandy Powell came up with the idea of doing the red stripes in a primitive way, doing it themselves with paint on whatever shirts they had available as a symbol. The Bowery boys were much more elegant. They had stovepipe hats, red fire shirts, black frock coats, check pants or plaid pants, and long boots. And so and what they called soap locks. Their hair was matted down in a special kind of shiny, almost like they used to call patent leather hair.
These people who have nothing, we think of dark and dreary and drab, and there's one thing that these people could have is color. It doesn't cost anything. You can't buy yourself a beautiful necklace, but you can, knit yourself a beautiful red scarf, and that takes the place. The color is the wealth of these people. It's at a time, too, where there's a richness of cultures emerging together, and everyone sort of brings their own experience from their world into this little pocket of the world, and the colors and the patterns made so much sense to bring life into these characters and into their situation.
How does this open?
It takes too long to lace back up. We'll be here all night. Sure, all right, I'll take it off.
Marty had quite strong ideas of how he saw Bill the Butcher, and he wanted him as a dandy, sort of showing off, really, sartorially, showing off his wealth in his clothes. So I started coming up with a few ideas and met Daniel, who initially had different ideas about where his character was coming from. But again, we tried on some shapes that we come up with, and it worked.
I'd never really imagined myself, Bill, or the natives to have been such peacocks. But from the moment that I began to try these things that she'd invented, they seemed quite right and wonderful.
Bill's outfits with all these different plaids and color just sort of clashing together, and everything was so rich.
Then they have to become clothes. I mean, that's the tough thing. With something as extreme as that, it takes a little more time to get used to it.
My character, she wasn't formal. You know, we think also of women being corseted up and these big, huge, you know, billowing skirts that weighed 30, 40 pounds. Sandy's, she just took that all away from the 5 points. She said, that doesn't exist here. Women don't have the money for that. And you think about it, you go, oh yeah, women wouldn't have the money for, you know, to build a complete structure around their body.
Yeah, the women were the most difficult to do to begin with, because you look at pictures of Victorian women and it's what everyone knows a Victorian woman looks like, with heavily corseted, huge crinolines if they're rich. Full length, fairly staid looking, you know, and we had to think, how could we make the women of this made up world go with the men? Because Marty wanted girls in the gangs as well. So I wanted to make them look a little tougher, and started again looking through reference and found some images of women who actually wore trousers underneath their skirts, and they were a group of women in the 1850s, I think, who were called dress reformers. And they were sort of like, you know, early day feminists, cutting up their long dresses, making the bottom bits into trousers and wearing them underneath their skirts. And we sort of used that, I used that as inspiration. The difficult thing was just producing the amount of costumes that we had to cope with the numbers of people. You know, it's phenomenally huge.
We alone, I think, have made something like 3,000 different costumes in our actual workshop, because that has also been the main factor, building things from scratch. And I'd say we have something like 7,000 costumes altogether.
This is a historical setting that hasn't been touched on very much by history books or by films.
It's beautiful and it's painful and it's passionate, and I don't know when I've seen a film like this ever before.
It's not only a good movie, it's a lesson in history.
There's more of us coming off these ships every day. 15,000 Irish a week. Get all of us together and we ain't got a gang. We got an army.
I took the father. Now I'll take the son.
I give you my word. This'll all be finished tomorrow.
No, it won't.
It's a long way we've come from the freckled hills to the steel.